One night unraveled a web of rules that had held an empire together for generations. What you are about to hear comes from ambassadorial dispatches, sealed palace inventories, private letters hidden in library bindings, and forensic readings of decrees that bureaucrats tried to erase. She arrived without status, without a name recorded in the formal annals, and in one ceremony she would turn that anonymity into a power that reshaped law and loyalty. In that single night, 5 unwritten codes of the court were broken in ways that reverberated across trade routes and royal alliances. Manuscripts from the imperial chancery, Venetian reports, and testimonies from palace surgeons now piece together a scene the official chronicles omitted. If you want more forbidden stories of courts and consorts, like this video and tell me in the comments which court lady or sultana you want exposed next. Now return with me to the winter when a sultan sat uneasy on his throne and the air in the capital smelled of cedar and ink. In the years surrounding Suleiman, the empire stretched like a coastline of power from the Balkans to the Persian border. Control of sea lanes and grain fields depended not only on ships and soldiers, but on the rituals that legitimized rule inside the palace. The harem was not a private curiosity, it was a political engine where marriages, endorsements, and alliances were forged in silence. The sultan was absolute, yet surrounded by counselors, viziers, and merchants whose ledgers and gifts mapped influence. Ambassadors from Venice and Habsburg courts arrived with crates of silk and lists of brides to gauge favor. The janissary commanders watched processions as if counting votes. A wedding inside the palace could be a private union or a public decree. The difference hinged on traditions that had been tacitly accepted for decades. Those traditions ensured the succession lines, the supervision of the harem by senior women, and the mediation of the Grand Vizier. Violate them and you did not merely offend etiquette, you altered the arithmetic of power that merchants and foreign courts used to place bets. This is why the details of that night mattered beyond perfume and candles. It mattered to merchants tracking routes to Alexandria and to an ambassador who would write home that a single ceremony could shift alliances as quickly as a fleet at sea. She had been called by several names before history settled on one. In private notes, she is a girl from the western shores of the Black Sea. In another language, she is a woman who grew up with salt on her fingertips. Her childhood was a string of markets and prayers, the chatter of relatives, and the ache of a lost father who taught her to read ledger marks as if they were holy text. The first paragraph of her life reads of a small room where light came through a lattice and the scent of roasted grain lingered. The second remembers a teacher who taught her
تاج رایمز و اتومان کرتسی ها و فیل چاک آن کالوست فینگار. The third remembers the night of capture, then the world narrowed to the smell of damp straw, the clink of chains, و the distant roar of horses. The fourth paragraph pauses at the first time a palace woman pressed a coin into her palm and said, "Learn to speak so you may survive." Those memories shaped her appetite for language, for law, and for the small rituals that make people believe in order. She used stories as a map and a mirror. She learned the power of a phrase that could mollify a vizier or unsettle the ear of an ambassador. This backstory is not mere color. It explains how a woman with no pedigree could read room and ledger alike and decide which tradition to pretend to honor and which to replace with a new practice of her design. Take a moment to react to that origin. If this revelation shocks you, pause and comment now. Start your comment with the word traitor or the word ally and name one person in court you think helped her. Your comment will not only shape the conversation, it will influence which figure I unearth next. The community here chooses the next archive to open, and your note helps fund trips to the libraries where these sealed letters still wait. Now we return to her arrival inside the palace and the lessons that became her first currency. In the training rooms of the harem, she learned the mechanics of influence. The mistress who supervised her was Nigar Khalfa, who smelt of rose oil and iron, and who taught her to fold a napkin as one folds a treaty. The eunuch Adem taught her the cadence of announcements and how to read the stoop of a man entering a room. In these lessons, the senses were weapons. She watched the glint of medals, listened to the scrape of sandals on marble, smelt incense that masked vermin, and learned to touch a shoulder in ways that yielded obedience. Conversation with a tutor named Selim was not idle. They argued classically and quietly. You must not enter the public garden without permission, Selim warned. Permission is language, she replied. He laughed low and said, permission can be manufactured. She answered, then teach me how. He said, notice details, not people. She said, I notice everything. He asked, and what will you use it for? She said, to carve passages where none exist. He said, that is dangerous. She said, danger is a kind of map. He said, so you will navigate it. She said, I already am. That exchange repeated in variations as she practiced tone and timing. Friends formed and rivalries sharpened. Rustem Pasha, a provincial envoy, noticed her at a reception and stooped to ask about a tapestry. Nigar Khalfa intervened with a polite smile and a pinch of saffron on a platter. These small scenes reveal how language and
sensory cues stitched her into the tapestries of power. She learned Persian and Arabic. She practiced lute and lament, and she memorized names of governors as if they were prayers. By the time Suleiman noticed her carriage, she was already fluent in the etiquette of effect. The training scenes smell of boiled sugar, of ink, of lemon, and human sweat. The textures of velvet, parchment, and skin became her study materials. Her rise began with minute infractions that felt like experiments before a final proof. The first transgression was procedural. She entered a chamber without the formal escort required for a woman of her origin. The second was ceremonial. She accepted a ring in a way that mimicked marriage, and in that mimicry she tested reactions. The third was legal. She secured a document from the imperial chancery that reworded the rights of a Haseki and left a clause ambiguous. In a dim room, she and allies whispered strategy. If the clause reads without prejudice, then the court assumes consent, murmured Ibrahim Pasha. Consent cannot be assumed, objected Isay, a senior attendant. Then write it into a private inventory, she said. A private inventory will be burned if found, warned Mustafa, a clerk. Then make 2 inventories, she proposed. One for the eyes of the palace, the other for the eyes of posterity, she finished. They nodded and arranged coded marks using thread and spice to mark pages. This dialogue extended across nights, 8 exchanges, at least as plans refined into action. The scene contained the metallic click of seals, the rustle of paper, the taste of bitter tea, the coldness of a marble table, and the sharp aroma of ink. The transgressions read like a list, but they were executed as conversation, as touch, and as a practice of small rituals that altered the meaning of larger laws. Networks of loyalty were her instruments. She cultivated allies by naming debts and repaying them with influence. Her web included Rustam Pasha, the envoy Nigar Khalfa, the eunuch Adem, the clerk Mustafa, the merchant Musa who moved goods between ports, and the Venetian Marco who smuggled letters. She built a spy network that used cafeteria gossip and market vendors as information nodes. Some letters were forged and sent to provoke a rival into rashness. Others were leaked to ambassadors to calibrate foreign response. In one intercepted exchange, she and a junior scribe rehearsed a false note to the Grand Vizier. "Send word that the Sultan is ill," she suggested. "Why would we lie about that?" the scribe asked. "Because a suggestion of illness brings men out from hiding," she said. The scribe hesitated, then agreed. The plan worked, and a provincial governor rushed to secure a fief and exposed a plot of his own. That exposure created space for her allies to move into vacant posts. Here, a moment of tension tightened the narrative. In 2 paragraphs, the palace held its breath. The court saw movement and misread intentions, and Senior Vizier lost a province as a result. This moment was a pivot. It lasted like a held breath and then released consequences that rattled treaties. The senses in that chapter were acute: the clink of coins, the whisper of silk, the sour tang of fear on a tongue, the damp blot of ink on fingers, and the visual of sealed letters piled like a small pyramid. The wedding night itself was staged as ritual, yet carried the air of a coup. Preparations filled the corridors with cedar smoke, with the sweet of sugared nuts, with the low chime of bells. Lanterns swung in oil light, painting faces half known. Suleiman arrived with a retinue that smelled of horse leather and rosewater. The ceremony was supposed to follow strict practice, a public vow in the presence of the Grand Vizier and the harem overseers, and then a private consummation sealed by the presence of witnesses. What transpired was a deliberate rewriting. Inside the inner chamber, lights were dimmed, not by accident but by design. Curtains smeared with a scent that blurred memory. There was a conversation that unfolded like a chess game, 8 to 10 exchanges, in which she and Suleiman tested tone. He said, "Do you know how dangerous this path is?" She replied, "I know every path by the sound it makes underfoot." He asked, "Will you accept the crown of expectation?" She said, "I accept only the parts that I can make law." He said, "Others will call it heresy." She said, "They will call it what they must, and I will name what I make." He asked, "Are you prepared to be both beloved and blamed?" She said, "I am prepared to be remembered." He paused and touched the edge of her sleeve and said, "Then speak plainly to the court tomorrow." She answered, "Tomorrow is already spoken." He asked, "Tonight, then, why alter the right?" She said, "To leave room for new words." He asked, "And if they burn the records?" She said, "They will not find the duplicate buried with the garden stones." He laughed softly and said, "You bury words like seeds." She said, "And they sprout into law." This exchange took place amid sensory detail: the rasp of silk, a faint metallic scent of coins, the taste of spiced wine, the press of warm bodies in a narrow hall, and the sound of drums fading into the night. The act that followed was less a consummation and more a public assertion, recorded in a clandestine inventory, a change in phrasing in a document that elevated her status while obscuring its form. That one change in phrasing was enough to begin a legal cascade. There were immediate consequences. Couriers ran to provincial courts, ambassadors wrote urgent letters, and the Venetian envoy Marco sent a dispatch noting unease at the palace. Rustam Pasha called an emergency audience, the Grand Vizier compiled a list of objections, and scholars were summoned to interpret. Precedent. A coalition of court elders conspired to force a legal review while merchants calculated risk for caravan routes. Reactions were named by officials such as Ibrahim Pasha, the Habsburg envoy Gregor, the Persian merchant Musa, the chronicler Mehmet, and the surgeon Selim, who later recorded physical signs of stress on officials. Riots in a port city erupted when a local judge used the new phrasing to justify a tax change. In the capital, a group of soldiers muttered in taverns, and the Janissary cartographer removed the Sultanate emblem from a map temporarily. Diplomats prepared to renegotiate terms of trade and royal marriages. Laws were reworded as emissaries bargained to translate the new precedent into foreign treaties. The waves were institutional, not only personal. A decree was drafted that redefined the rights of a Haseki and assigned an endowment fund to a foundation under her name, which changed the funding flows that supported provincial governors. The scene smelled of paper and smoke, and the sounds of harsh whispering as old men flipped pages searching for previous formulas. At the center, she remained enigmatic, both strategist and beloved figure. Some called her savior, others a usurper. Moment of tension followed where alliances tilted and bloodless purges occurred. In 2 paragraphs, a faction lost office and was publicly disgraced. The papers printed names and property inventories, and a surgeon recorded traces of stress. The fall of a senior vizier sent men scrambling, and rumor replaced policy for a time. Another moment of tension occurred when a falsified letter was exposed in front of visiting ambassadors. The room went cold, and a merchant named Musa covered his mouth and nearly choked on the sweet spice he had been tasting. The diplomatic fallout required skillful forensics, a process that later historians would reconstruct from marginalia in registers. That forensic process is worth a brief technical note. It involved cross-referencing ink composition, handwriting patterns, and delivery logs in a task that modern readers might call document forensics. The procedure was precise, quick, and accessible to those with knowledge of papermaking and seal impressions. The third moment of tension was public unrest in a provincial market where a new decree touched pocketbooks. In those hours, the smell of smoke from torches mixed with the salt air, and the sound of hasty footsteps became the new map of consequence. After 1 month, the palace adjusted outward show. The public calendar carried a new festival where she was present, a mausoleum fund was announced, and certain court rituals were retimed to reflect the new status. Some ambassadors publicly congratulated the Sultan while writing privately that the balance of power had shifted. Rustam Pasha secured a governorship, his name on new ledgers. The merchant Musa gained exclusive permission to move certain goods. Nigar Khalfa received a formal title, and Adem the eunuch a stipend. At street level, vendors in a neighborhood by the spice bazaar found their taxes reassessed to fund the endowment. Women in the harem whispered, and a few began to wear small tokens that matched marks in the duplicate inventory. In 3 months, foreign courts had adjusted. The Venetian Marco sent a careful congratulations and a request to confirm trade guarantees. The Habsburg envoy Gregor recalibrated his marriage proposals, and the Persian merchants rerouted their caravans. Scholars in the capital published treatises arguing both for and against the legal framing she had introduced. The debate entered coffee houses, with men and women repeating phrases from court as if they were recipes. By 6 months, institutional change hardened into policy. The endowment funded a school that recorded its own rules. The title associated with her name appeared in treaties, and a modest mausoleum's foundation began construction near a caravanserai. Names of allies were entrenched in official lists, and rivals had been reassigned, often to distant provinces. The physical landscape changed. Small stairways in the palace were walled, and new passages opened. A library catalog listed the duplicate inventory, and a patched manuscript surfaced in a monastery binding across the sea. Her legacy became architectural, fiscal, and legal in equal measure. Some saw a consolidation of power that enabled stability. Others saw the beginning of dynastic friction that would later erupt. In the end, the wedding night was a legal operation, a rhetorical shift, and a human performance. It was brilliant, and it was ruthless. It rewrote rules that had been treated as sacrosanct and left behind monuments of paper and stone that future generations would read with mixed admiration and horror. She stands in history as both architect and instrument, as a woman who used intimacy and ink to build an order in which she could operate. The mausoleum fund still exists, the endowment still pays stipends, and a line in a treaty bears wording first recorded in that clandestine inventory. Whether she saved the state or remade it for personal ascendancy remains a question we still ask when we read the marginal notes in those old files. If this shadowy corner of history moved you, subscribe to follow the next excavation and share this video so more documents might be funded for study. Leave a final comment naming one tangible object you would want to find in these archives: a sealed letter, a broken seal, a duplicate inventory, or a merchant log. And I will use your choice as a clue for our next visit to archives. If you want deeper analysis of the documents cited here, I will link my transcripts and source notes for scholars and curious minds.